Welcome, HR pros, managers, and data enthusiasts to this explainer. Today, we're going to completely demystify the academic and statistical foundations of measuring human performance in the workplace. It's a huge topic, so let's get right into it. Look, we've all experienced the dread, or, maybe the triumph of a performance review. But today, we're exploring the high-stakes science behind why these evaluations so often feel totally unfair. We'll look at how they actually work under the hood, and ultimately, how we might go about fixing them. Okay, here is our roadmap for today. We are covering 4 core areas: the foundation of measurement, building psychometric scales, what do we measure, and finally, rating and ranking employees. All right, jumping right into section 1, the foundation of measurement, specifically reliability versus validity. So before we can even think about evaluating an employee, we've got to know if our measuring stick actually works, right? It's absolutely crucial to grasp the difference here. Reliability just means the measure gives you consistent results. Think about inter-rater agreement, like if 2 different managers give the exact same score to the exact same employee. That's reliable. Validity, on the other hand, asks, does this tool actually measure what it claims to measure? And here's the golden rule. You cannot have a valid assessment if it isn't reliable first. Reliability is basically a strict prerequisite for validity. I love this analogy because it brilliantly illustrates the difference. Just picture a broken analog clock stuck at 11:55. Now that clock is perfectly reliable, right? It gives you the exact same reading every single day without fail. But it is completely, entirely invalid because it isn't measuring the actual time. And let's be honest, you definitely do not want your company's performance metrics functioning like a broken clock. That brings us to section 2, building psychometric scales, or basically how we construct these tools. Okay, so now that we know reliability has to come first, let's look at the tools we build using those rules, psychometric scales. Way back in 1929, a researcher named Thurstone established this golden rule, stating that rating scales need equally appearing intervals. In plain English, that just means the psychological space between your survey options has to be perfectly even. Think about the literal physical distance representing that psychological space. By using direct antonyms for the opposite ends of the scale, strongly disagree way over on the left and strongly agree on the far right, we're trying to keep that space totally equal. But honestly, this is incredibly challenging to build in practice. In fact, if you look closely at a lot of common corporate surveys, they actually violate this rule all the time. They use clunky phrasing that just completely warps that psychological distance. Also, think about it. A single rating scale only gives you discrete jumping data points, like a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. But true psychometric scales, they need to yield continuous data. To actually get there, statisticians combine an employee's responses from several related items to calculate a meaningful, continuous mean score. It basically fills in all those decimal spaces between the whole numbers. But wait, how do we actually know those combined items even belong together in the first place? Well, first, there's a statistical technique called factor analysis that groups related themes. Then, to mathematically guarantee that these grouped items are all measuring the exact same thing reliably, statisticians calculate something called Cronbach's alpha coefficient. Now, the absolute magic number here is an alpha greater than 0.75. If your score falls below that, it means the items aren't consistently measuring the same concept, and HR teams literally have to delete those flawed items just to maintain the scale's integrity. Moving right along to section 3, what do we measure? We'll be looking at behaviors, results, and traits. So here is the crucial point. Once we actually have these mathematically sound scales, what exactly are we measuring about our employees? Because job performance is highly, highly multidimensional. A great example of this is the 2013 model by Aguinis, which really highlights how performance happens in context. You see, a performer has underlying traits, they engage in specific behaviors, and then those behaviors produce various results. And an employer basically has to choose which of these 3 levels to evaluate an employee on. The catch, though, is that measuring behaviors or traits usually relies on subjective supervisor or peer ratings, which, let's be real, are absolutely fraught with human bias. So, whenever possible, HR really needs to rely on objective results. For jobs like sales executives, this means looking at hard, undeniable data: sales volume, annual sales growth, market share, maybe even rate of promotion. The ultimate goal is to anchor your evaluations in objective reality, at least whenever the job allows for it. Okay, so we've covered the ideals of measurement and the beauty of objective data. But how do we actually apply this to employee performance in the messy real world? This question takes us right out of the safe, controlled world of academic statistics and drops us right into the high-stakes, highly challenging reality of corporate evaluations. Which brings us to Section 4, Rating and Ranking Employees. It's time to look at the battle between comparative and absolute measurement. When appraisal time rolls around, managers basically have two options. You either compare employees directly against an objective standard, or you compare them against each other. Let's dive into that second one, comparative measurement, and see how this builds into the rather infamous rank and yank system. In this kind of environment, workers are strictly stacked up against their peers. And wow, the stakes in comparative systems are brutally high. Under a strict rank and yank approach, the top 20% of performers are heavily rewarded. But on the flip side, the bottom 10%, they are actively pushed out of the organization. They're let go, and new employees are brought in to replace them. What's truly staggering here is that despite its aggressive nature, this method is actually used by 20% of Fortune 500 companies. But the big question is, does it actually work? Well, in 2011, researchers Mulligan and Bull-Schaeffer decided to run computer simulations on this exact approach. They wanted to see how different turnover rates might affect overall workforce performance potential over a massive 30-year span, basically comparing these strict rank and yank models against just standard voluntary turnover. And the data from those simulations revealed something pretty fascinating. When mapped out over 3 decades, a strict 10% turnover rate actually appears to be the most optimal point for maintaining a high workforce performance potential. So mathematically speaking, continually cycling out that bottom 10% does seem to yield long-term organizational results. But hold on, it's not quite that simple. Researchers like Agouinas and O'Boyle point out a major flaw. Forcing employees into these rigid percentiles assumes that human performance naturally follows a standard bell curve, but they argue that performance actually follows a power law distribution instead. That means a few star performers are out there producing exponentially more than the rest of the team combined. A strict ranking system can sometimes lump these exponential stars together, totally skewing how their perceived value is calculated relative to one another. So, to avoid the strict toxicity of forced peer rankings, a lot of companies opt for absolute measurements. This is where instead of comparing you to your coworker, they compare you directly to the job standard itself. This includes methods like manager essays, behavior checklists, or BARS, which stands for Behaviorally Anchored Rating Scales. But as we can see, absolute measurement isn't perfect either. I mean, essays might reflect a manager's writing skill a lot more than the employee's actual performance. And BARS, they are notoriously challenging to construct with those equally appearing intervals we talked about earlier. Bottom line, every single method carries its own unique set of subjective challenges. All right, let's wrap this up and review our key takeaways from this explainer. First, measurement has to start with reliability, because if it isn't consistent, it simply can't be valid. Second, building true psychometric scales requires real mathematical precision to ensure equal psychological space. Third, we should absolutely aim to measure objective results rather than subjective traits whenever we can. Fourth, if an organization uses comparative rankings like rank and yank, just know the stakes are incredibly high, even if the math shows optimal turnover rates. And finally, if you go with absolute measurement, remember it still requires immensely careful construction to avoid bias. Just think about the last time your manager rated your performance. Hopefully, they used objective results, reliable scales, and didn't subject you to some arbitrary forced comparison. So I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought to consider before your organization's next round of appraisals. Take a really close look at the tools, the scales, and the metrics your HR department is using. Ask yourself, are you truly measuring excellence and fostering growth, or are you just reading a perfectly reliable yet entirely broken clock? Until next time, keep questioning the data.